Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to Baraza. This is a special Baraza because it's tied to our China-Africa working group, which organized a symposium earlier this week with a focus on the pandemic. So Dr. Folashade Soulé's talk this afternoon will address some of those very same concerns. I want to thank my colleagues in the China-Africa Working Group, Dr. Agnes Leslie and Dr. Anita Spring and several others for continuing to address, promote, investigate, and really build a whole network of inquiry and up-to-date research exchange on Africa and China. Before we go to the talk and the introduction of our speaker, I want to share a slide that has 3 recent publications that have come out of the work of the China-Africa Working Group at the Center for African Studies here at UF. This is published in the African Studies Quarterly, which is an online academic journal that's edited and published right here at the center. It's been with the center for over 20 years. The China-Africa group edited a special issue in 2016 on media in China and Africa, another one in 2018 on African migrants in China, and most recently, an issue on the Belt and Road Initiative and its impacts on Africa. So they've really been prolific, and this has become a record of the varied developments and debates about China's relationship and involvement in Africa. So let me turn things over to Dr. Anita Spring, who'll be introducing the speaker. And thanks again for joining us this afternoon.
Okay, I think you can hear me. Am I muted or can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes? Okay, wonderful. I've had a lot of trouble with this computer. I'm not sure why. But anyway, well, welcome. We're so happy to have you with us. Dr. Soulé is a lecturer and senior research associate at Oxford University, and she's in the Blaviknik, is that how it's pronounced? I was trying to get it right, School of Government. So she has been researching China-Africa relations for a fair while, I would say, and she has looked at the subject of agency in Africa in relation to international relations on the one hand and politics on the other, and for the third hand, it's really South-South cooperation. So those things just fit right into our content and our interests in the China-Africa Working Group. Let me just also say that we have Agnes, of course, and myself leading the charge on this, but we have 2 other people whose pictures or names we can see at this time. Lina Ben Abdullah has been interested in this subject for a very long time. A relatively new book came out. What's the name of it? Oh, okay, we'll get that later.
Shaping the Future of Power.
Yes, that's it. And Oscar, who is coming in from Kenya, we may see him. He is another member of the working group. So we've been working to put these various performances and lectures on, and we've had a great deal of fun. Now, in addition to being at the University of...
Isfan.
Oh, is this, did he just come on? No. Oh, okay, I missed Isfan. So Isfan, he's in Hungary. He might, isn't that about 9.5 hours difference? I think so, maybe another hour or so. Anyway, Isfan was with us yesterday and did a brilliant job with our panelists. Jevons was with us yesterday. He was one of the lecturers. And we're just, we think other people are going to join in a little bit later. I want to get back to Dr. Folashade's CV a little bit. Before being at Oxford, for example, she was a postdoc fellow at the London School of Economics and an Oxford Princeton University Global Leader Fellow. Okay, all those words. So she was a fellow, a Global Leader Fellow at the London School of Economics and at the Oxford Princeton conglomeration. So we like her work so much, you know. I have to put in a bit of an aside here because I fell in love, if you can fall in love with an article, in 2019, in which you argued for several points on how Africans should actually be interacting with China and the Chinese programs and the Belt and Road, and that a lot of African countries, people have sort of literally missed some of the ideas about how to manifest this best. And I think in that publication, you went through the list that people had to not only work with politicians, be very careful with politicians because they also have political goals that they want to see accomplished. And you noted that almost every level, whether it's down to the exact technicians who are going to execute a project, or we were thinking of Belt and Road at that time, they need to be included in the negotiation. So one of the things that we've been focusing on, and it's in our description of what this session is all about, all these sessions, is African agency. And so I think you really nailed it on the head, so to speak, to mention the things that are necessary to really have African agency. So I thank you for that. And so I assume today you are continuing on. And let's see, Agnes, you want to tell us the title of her talk? Can you do that? We went through a number of incarnations. Which is the final one? Folashade, what is the final name of your talk? Because we had, I think, 3 different ones, so I don't remember what.
Yeah, well, no, there were just 2. So
Okay.
it will be Africa and China's COVID-19 diplomacy, reflecting on African agency.
Ah, see, there she got it all in. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Anita, for this, I would say, very comprehensive introduction. So it is a great pleasure for me to be addressing this keynote today and to engage, even though virtually, with the research and student community from the Center of African Studies at the University of Florida. And in a context of global uncertainties and shifting political and economic futures that the continent, and I would say even the whole world, is facing, I have chosen to focus this lecture on the specific topic that is Africa and China's COVID-19 diplomacy, and more particularly to reflect on African agency. So I will put my slides on, and I hope you'll be able to see it. So can you see it?
Yes.
Yes,
Thank
we're
you.
good.
So the focus on African agency here stems from a willingness not only to highlight how China has been deploying a very active and dynamic health diplomacy and more, in Africa for the past year. And I will get back on, I will detail more what this diplomacy has been focused on, but the purpose is also to interrogate how African actors have managed and organized this relationship. And as you mentioned, Anita, and as I've written in my previous publications, it's equally important to recenter African actors as agents in their diplomatic activity with external powers, instead of analyzing the continent solely as a commodity or as a space subject to external powers competition. And in my latest piece on African agency that was published a few months ago in African Affairs, I also focus a lot on this aspect beyond China, just Africa and Africa's involvement in summit diplomacy more largely. So a focus on African agency and on agency is particularly relevant as it allows us to understand how African agents exercise this capacity to do in various spaces. So this keynote will delve into a few questions, the following questions that are, first of all, how are the relations between China and African countries evolving because of the pandemic? And what are the main futures of China's COVID-19 diplomacy in Africa? How is this evolving relationship being negotiated? How have African actors, whether state, sub-state, private actors, non-state actors, been able to exert any agency in this context? Will COVID-19 affect national policies, whether it's Chinese and African negotiating strategies in the future on infrastructure projects, for instance? And to conclude, what does this evolving relationship suggest for the study of African agency in, particularly in Sino-African relations, but also more largely in global politics? So, health diplomacy, now if I have to start with some conceptual definitions, it's at the interface between international health assistance and international political relations. And global public health diplomacy has and will most likely become a future and a key and strategic part of how traditional and emerging powers carry out their diplomacy in Africa and in the developing world. And we've seen this particularly with China's COVID diplomacy in Africa. So the key features of China's COVID diplomacy, I would say, were activism, speed, high publicization, and by a combination of what I call bi-multilateralism, but that's a combination of bilateralism and multilateralism. So China has carried out a very visible and active humanitarian assistance, and I'll try to show that a bit on this slide with some of the pictures that were very much present in the global media. And so this assistance, has been carried out both with traditional state actors, but also via non-traditional actors in the sectors like philanthropists, Jack Ma and the Alibaba Foundation, who provided earlier on several cargoes of masks, PPE. It was often dubbed as, mask diplomacy or corona diplomacy. Chinese government and SOEs also provided assistance via medical teams, in part for their workers and also for African health officials. So there was a double use there. And in Africa, the use of medical personnel coming from China is an evolution of Beijing's relief efforts on the continent, which initially focused quite exclusively on the distribution of PPE and other medical supplies. It's interesting, for instance, to know that in the case of Algeria and Nigeria, the cost of the PPE and medical personnel was not underwritten by the central Chinese government, but instead by Chinese state-owned enterprises that currently operate in two countries. So this also follows a similar approach in countries like Zimbabwe, where Chinese businesses donated $500,000 to refurbish the Wilkins Hospital, that is currently the country's primary COVID-19 treatment center. So, as you can see, visibility was a key feature. And what the pandemic has shown in the context of China-Africa's relations and China's COVID diplomacy is how social media can be mobilized as a tool of public health diplomacy. Clearly, with China, Twitter accounts of both the Chinese embassies, Chinese media, I'm talking about Chinese embassies in Africa, but also Africa partner countries and regional organizations like the African Union accounts were mobilized to showcase, the Chinese effort to provide support. And that is, maybe I would say, a key difference with other donors, given that these goods were targeted for direct use by local citizens in a context of emergency, and also for health workers. and that it was so heavily publicized via social media, it made more impact in terms of visibility and on maintaining the image that China's aid is more concrete, right? And all of this, with the overarching objective of winning the hearts and minds of people. And publicizing this health diplomacy is also a means of addressing and countering the narratives around China's early missteps in managing the outbreak domestically, something that started to get heavily politicized also in Africa. So China's COVID diplomacy was also characterized by the organization of an extraordinary virtual summit that was chaired by President Xi Jinping and 13 African leaders who took part in this virtual event, including South Africa's president and African Union chairperson, and the chair of the African Union Commission. And the summit focused on addressing the health and economic impact of COVID-19 through the Africa-China partnerships, and also talks around depths, although there was nothing groundbreaking that was announced. But the summit saw China's renewed commitment to the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Africa CDC, the main health coordinating body of the continental response to COVID-19, but also a promise to speed the construction of infrastructure and the new building for the institutions. So virtual summits that have become a key feature in this global context. Virtual summits or participation in virtual conferences, despite their limits, have also surged since, let's say, diplomacy must go on. And in such a global health and economic crisis, officials and leaders need to be seen as exercising leadership and delivering for their constituencies. While also many of them, especially in the African context, face electoral processes in the upcoming months. So they need to be seen as responsible and close to their citizens, and participating in these summits also allows them to showcase that, at least. So there's a double benefit here for China to showcase, this whole idea of solidarity and so on, but also for African leaders to be seen as active and responsible and close to their citizens as well. What is the summit, but more globally speaking? So social media was also heavily mobilized by African leaders, African regional organizations like the African Union, Africa CDC, to communicate. And what was interesting here is that China, once the pandemic was under control, also resumed a more classic public diplomacy through official visits by the Chinese foreign minister, who carried out a 5-country tour with official visits to Seychelles, Nigeria, DRC, Botswana, Tanzania. And this is something that is very recurrent. At the beginning of the year, the first trips, overseas trips by the Chinese foreign minister is always in Africa. And so the agenda was largely dominated, again, by COVID-related projects, debt infrastructure projects also, such as the 1.3 billion contract to construct a railway linking Lake Victoria port of Mwanza to Isaka, which connects the seaport of Dar es Salaam, and which was won by the China Civil Engineering Construction and China Railway Construction. So the economic damage that was brought by the coronavirus will probably lead more African countries also to seek debt restructuring, and debt negotiation was also a key feature of China's COVID-19 diplomacy. More and more countries are opting for the G20 DSSI framework currently, whether it's Ethiopia, Chad, and Zambia. And these countries are also amongst the highest indebtedness to China. I mean, and I'm talking about Ethiopia, Angola, and Kenya, if I refer to latest data by the China Africa Research Initiative. So China has been called out because normally the G20 framework aims to bring creditors, including China, into an agreement to rework the debt of countries in danger of defaulting. And China has been called out to do more, given that it's Africa's first bilateral creditor. And so, but progressively, China participated in the G20 DSSI, but also opted for parallel continuation of its classic government-to-government bilateral relationship and debt restructuring, and also non-commercial loans cancellation, although they represent a very small percentage of all of this. So another feature of this is Chinese vaccine diplomacy and vaccine aid that is currently being deployed. So Chinese diplomats are also, let's say, demonstrating Beijing's beneficence by promising countries around Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America for preferential access to a Chinese vaccine. And since Xi Jinping's pledge in May that China-made vaccines will be a global public good, China has added the words also at a fair and reasonable price to its offer of a vaccine as a global public good. So in the case of Africa, there's been a combination, and it's not at this point. It's an evolving process. But there's been a combination of both vaccine orders by African countries, but also vaccine donations by Chinese actors. And again, this has been heavily publicized in the press and on social media by Chinese national Twitter accounts, but also channels such as CGTN. And the combination of vaccine aid and vaccine diplomacy shows how vaccine distributions have become very political. And it's not only the case of China. Russia is also part of this, is also carrying out such a diplomacy. So how is this evolving relationship being negotiated? It's important, as I mentioned, to note that there's a key strategy of China's COVID diplomacy is a combination of bilateralism and multilateralism. So they participate in multilateral initiatives to show also responsibility as a response as well to the critics, but most of the decisions and the critical discussions are being led through the classic government-to-government bilateral relationships. So when you look, for instance, at the vaccine diplomacy, so if you look at health diplomacy first, Africa, the Africa CDC new headquarters in Addis, were discussed at the bilateral level. It was mentioned at the summit as well, but that went through a classic bilateral channel. Debt diplomacy, as I said in the beginning, participation both in multilateral initiatives like the DSSI, but on its own terms. In addition to that, direct bilateral debt renegotiations with African states. Vaccine diplomacy, it's also a combination of bilateralism and multilateralism. China joins COVAX, the multilateral framework, the COVAX initiative, but at the same time, it negotiates bilateral orders and bilateral deals with countries like Morocco and Egypt, who were part of the trials from Sinovac and Sinopharm and through these bilateral channels, the orders are being taken, but also donations. So in all of this, so I mentioned debt already through both the combination of these two, bilateralism and multilateralism. So in all of this, where does African agency lie, right? First of all, it's important to understand that agency, as it is defined, isn't just a reflex opposition or just a mere reaction to the actions of other agents. Agency should be understood as something that is directed, intentional, meaningful, and let's say a self-reflective social or political action. It involves a deliberate act and an organized one to address a particular situation. So I often use this slide to explain how actors. Sorry, I can hear someone's.
We all have our information.
Okay, let me just continue. So there are. It's important when you first to unpack and locate the African agency. When we talk about African agency or African agentic practices, it's important to look at the actors, the resources, the repertoires of action, but also the context, right? In terms of actors, it's about identifying the specific sets of, whether it's state actors, but also non-state actors that are, exercising agency, in which context. So it needs to be analytically situated. And finally, also in terms of a repertoire, what are the resources that they have, right? Since they are differently located, they do not necessarily have the same resources. So in this context, talking about African agency, if I first start with African state agency, and by state agency, I mention, I'm talking about the capacity of African state actors, like governments, presidents, and so on, that are positioned in an asymmetrical relationship with China to focus on short-term, but also strategic goals in relation and also the spaces where they hold a relatively limited influence over the rules of the game. So China's, first of all, it's important to mention that China's COVID diplomacy was not only taught and carried out on Chinese premises. African actors weren't passive. They exercised agency in various ways. And even before China carried out its own mask and PPE diplomacy, several African countries sent medical supplies to China in order for the country to face its own breakout as a means, and this as a means to show solidarity and goodwill. And at my presentation slide, there was a picture of a manufacturing company in South Africa that sent several masks to China, and that was also quite publicized in the South African context. But when we look at health diplomacy, if we look at where agency was exercised, if we look at health diplomacy, and there's been a central role of the African Union and Africa CDC in coordinating Africa's response and various donations from China to be dispatched. And also particularly the role of a public company, Ethiopian Airlines. Ethiopian Airlines intentionally positioned itself in this particular context as a focal point, as a hub, in a context where most airlines were and still are struggling due to limited mobility. So Ethiopian Airlines Cargo was the main airline company who got involved in the fast delivery of PPEs a few months ago with delivery speed. And as questions have been asked about who will handle the logistics, or that is transportation, but also distribution of the vaccines in Africa, Ethiopian Airlines has announced the launch of a cold chain air freight to transport these temperature-sensitive medicines, including COVID-19 vaccines. And the company really positioned itself as a logistics hub and signed a partnership agreement with the logistics arm of China's Alibaba Group to launch this cold chain air freight for transporting these vaccines. But it's not only Ethiopian Airlines, you have Kenya Airways as well, that unveiled its pharma facility at the Kenyatta International Airport, now one of the most important logistics hubs in Africa, announcing that the facility's immediate focus will be improving logistics in distributing vaccines across the continent. Beyond this example, you have others. You have the fact that African leaders seem to have what some call a basket strategy, with the objective to benefit from all baskets, and baskets being represented by various emerging powers that have a certain interest in Africa. And so it's not only China. And the idea is to choose partnerships wisely based on specific interest, and also this wish to benefit from all. And that's the case of Guinea, for instance, who, despite offers from China, wants to maintain a good relationship with its strategic partner, that is Russia. And so in Guinea, the Russian vaccination campaign was launched on 30 December on an experimental basis. The defense minister, a scientist by training, was also the first to receive the vaccine. And the Guinean National Health Security Agency has ordered 2 million doses from Russia to be able to vaccinate vulnerable people. But also, they've also placed orders in China, although less. So another example of where African agency has been exercised is in debt renegotiations, and especially in terms of discursive practices, because the situation is highly asymmetric. So it's for African actors, especially in the case of Zambia, for instance, to exert agency, it's something that is quite difficult. So leaders, Zambian leaders, chose to use these discursive practices in the form of calls for renegotiations to frame the debate. Zambian leaders announced that they would resist pressure from Chinese creditors to make paying areas a condition of pursuing debt relief talks, especially as Zambia was struggling to restructure about 11 billion of external debts. So Zambia has obtained a relief from some of its bilateral creditors under the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which includes up to 4 years to repay and the deferral of areas. But it was struggling to strike a deal with Chinese creditors that together own around a third of its debt. So the Zambian strategy was to play on China's participation in the multilateral initiatives, as the rules from the DSSI seemed to fit its interest more than the bilateral agreement that some Chinese creditors were trying to reach. And while some official institutions asked Zambia to pay as a precondition to grant the DSSI treatment, Zambia insisted that Chinese official creditors apply the same treatment of areas as is granted by all Paris Club and just Western creditors. They also called out on the fact that there are multiple Chinese creditors, some being considered official creditors and others being considered as commercial, that have taken different views. So what is interesting to see here is how a country like Zambia, that is in the position that could look as, well, that is one of fragility, is able to exercise agency through by using the fact that China plays on both bilateralism and multilateralism, and by choosing, a way that is closer to its own interests. It's not only the case of Zambia. There have been calls from other African leaders for China's enhanced participation in the DSSI. Ghana's finance minister wrote in the Financial Times that China's approach to debt negotiations was making Western creditors reluctant to offer concessions for fear that released resources will simply be transferred to Beijing. So it's quite interesting to see this combination of state agency in the context of China's COVID-19 diplomacy that is exercised at various levels, whether it's health diplomacy, debt renegotiations, and also vaccine diplomacy. But beyond state agency, of course, there are other actors, and I'd like to talk a bit about the subset, but especially the civic agency, and by civic I mean civil society actors, agency in the context of this diplomacy. So civic agency was also exerted by non-state African actors during the episode of racist mistreatment towards African in China, where Africans became targets of accusations that they were spreading the virus, and they were denied access in stores, in malls, restaurants, and many put on house arrest. And this created a huge backlash among African public opinions, also in China to some extent, especially that this is not the first time that something happens like that. At least it's not the first episode of Africans being subject to racism in China. It shows that China-African relations also have been largely dominated by government-to-government relations and focused less on, I would say, the people's concerns and the African diaspora's concerns in China. Since anti-Black racism almost never makes it to the agenda of these official meetings. But in this particular case, civic agency was exerted by African diaspora organizations. I'm thinking about Black Liberty, Black China Caucus, but also other civil society organizations who organized really in terms of coalitions, but mobilized various communities, but also diplomats, finding allies, diplomats, embassies, African embassies, and also the African Union and the Chinese government who chose to address these incidents directly with the Chinese embassies in Africa to some extent, and at least lift the restrictions that were put on the Africans in China. So in this context, one of the questions also is, will COVID-19 affect national policies, Chinese and African negotiating strategies? There have been some shifts recently in popular perceptions about China. So the latest Afrobarometer database and survey results on perception on China shows that China is still popular, but this popularity has been slipping. And if you look at this graph, the one on let's say more granular details of this, you can see that the majority of African citizens say that Chinese economic activities have, let's say, some to a lot of influence on their country's economies, but this perceived influence has declined from 71% in 2015 to 56% in 2019 across the countries that were surveyed in both rounds. And while 6 out of 10 Africans see China's influence on their country as positive, this perception has declined from 65% to 60% across the countries. And other regional African powers, Russia, for instance, but also international organizations also score quite well. So there have also been some shifting perceptions on debt. Right? The Afrobarometer survey released that less than half, just 48% of African citizens are aware of Chinese loans or financial assistance to their country. So this highlights already the lack of transparency and that these deals are surrounded with. And among those who said that they were aware of Chinese assistance, more than 77% were concerned about loan repayment, and a majority thought that their government had borrowed too much money from China. And more particularly in countries which received the most of loans. I'm thinking about Kenya, Angola, Ethiopia. Citizens expressed a worry about indebtedness. In Kenya, 87%, Angola, 75% of people surveyed, and 60% in Ethiopia were respectively concerned about the debt burden. So what is to be expected here? First of all, there will be more and more requests for transparency, I think, and also responsibility by African governments on contracting debt for infrastructure. Chinese loans and African debt is increasingly becoming a matter of public debate in these countries. And so better coordination policies for negotiating infrastructure projects, building on lessons learned, and establish a coherent China strategy. Although this is a pre-COVID issue, I think there will be more and more pressure internally for African governments to deliver on this specific topic. Also, there will be a more pressing demand for, I mentioned transparency, but also local content. African actors, whether it's civil or sub-state actors as well, will become more and more demanding and will request increasing national preference and local content from their government. Last week, there was an uproar shortly after the Kenyan government picked a Chinese company to maintain two terminals at the Kenyatta International Airport for a period of 1 year. And the other contestants, mostly Kenyan, however, raised objections to the tendering process, accusing Kenya Airports Authority of flouting the rules. So this is something that is not specific to Kenya. In many countries, there's an increasing demand, and I think this demand will even be stronger in a post-COVID in a post-COVID era in Africa, where many of these countries will be hardly hit by the economic crisis. And so relationship with China, although there is some I think there is some there's a positive image of China's activism, but in terms of infrastructure projects and many of the projects that are won by Chinese contractors, there will be an increasing demand for more local content from various African actors. And so to conclude, what's next for the study of African agency and Africa-China relations in this particular context is that, as shown by how African actors have engaged in China's COVID-19 diplomacy, agency produced by African actors is a product of their interactions with other actors, with structures, with the processes. And so this makes the exercise of agency both relational and dynamic, while keeping in mind all the constraints that are faced by various African actors. The focus on agency I mentioned allows us, to challenge the narrative that that presents the continent as, a perpetual victim, lacking initiative, lacking political initiative, being acted upon. So African actors, they show a certain level of creativity in their relations with China, which leads them to showcase more ingenuity in how to deal with China, but also leads Chinese actors either to collaborate but also exercising forms of counter agency, right? Finding ways to counter some of these moves. So I think what's next here is that an analysis of African agency that includes, but goes beyond just locating and unpacking African agency here and there. It's necessary. Let's say it's important to move beyond that to also start categorizing more, coming up with a larger, I would say, typology, categorization of African agency, since it's used with greater frequency and proliferates in social inquiry. It appears to be methodologically imperative to develop this categorization and provide a greater understanding of these types of agency. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Folashade. So we can take questions or comments from the room. We have about 45 minutes left. If you ask a question, I will enable your video. It will be up to you whether you decide to engage your video.
Okay.
So please use your raise your hand function and I'll call on you. Okay, Agnes, go ahead.
Thank you, Folashade, for your very illuminating talk and for giving us the whole view related to China-Africa relations, and particularly related to that. I want to start with a question and then a comment. So yesterday we talked about mask diplomacy, really using this mask diplomacy in terms of China really covering up some of the things that are, have been going on between China and Africa relations. So for instance, we talk about loud diplomacy, like, the issue of donating vaccines to Africa. How many African countries have received them from China? The issue of, African countries receiving ventilators, for instance, for South Africa, when it was actually found out there were only 5 ventilators given to that country. So, there is this moment of loud diplomacy, but, in terms of its engagement, but sometimes it's not followed by the actual action. And then, on the continental side, there's quiet diplomacy because, for instance, what you mentioned, right, about South Africa donating masks to China, nobody heard about it. So it's really very, very interesting, and that's how it's masked. But the question that I have is related to the Zambian issue. I think it moves from diplomacy now to just taking action, because it's not, the Zambian government is not really being diplomatic because it just downright refused to pay. So do you see more countries becoming just much more anti-diplomatic and taking the stand, for instance, that Zambia took, in deciding, well, we're going to just do this, because this is the best we can do for our country? I'll leave it at that so that I don't have to ask too many questions. I'll ask them later.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Agnes, for your comments and question. Should I answer now or should I collect a few more? Todd, I don't know how.
What's your preference? It's up to you.
Well, I'll answer this one, and I think for the next one, we can take them 2 by 2.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. So in terms of mass diplomacy, understood in as you mentioned, in the actual mass diplomacy, and also the idea of covering up, I think that it's important to see why, let's say, you have the functions of it and the strategic uses, right? As I mentioned in my presentation, mass diplomacy, PPE diplomacy, and so on, I think it was very much publicized and heavily publicized in the early beginnings of the pandemic, right? Especially donations of PPE, masks, and so on. So yes, afterwards, there were lots of complaints, not on some of them on the quality, some of them on some critics also on, the as you mentioned, the lack of ventilators and so on. So I think it's important to include that as well in the analysis. But I think China's strategic objective of showcasing dynamism, a very dynamic relationship. And also if you compare it with the other major powers, I think this goal was, I think they achieved the goal of showcasing that. But again, I think this action beyond that needs to be unpacked as well. And yes, you can see that there are many shortcomings. And when you oppose it, as you mentioned, to quiet diplomacy, I think that the machine that is behind, China's very vocal, visual, and very, showcasing promotional diplomacy and strategy is something that, it's not new. it's not new. And you mentioned the fact that South Africa's donations, and it's not only South Africa that donated to China. There were many other countries, not only African actually, because even in France, a country like France, there were some discussions by, at least internally at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to say that, you know, when they donated masks to China during the pandemic, China accepted them, the Chinese government accepted them, but asked them not to be too vocal about it, not to promote it too much on social media. And so they were so surprised that, you know, when it was France's turn to be in need of masks, and China donated many, and also, you know, there were many orders from France. It was just the extreme opposite of what they had asked France. It was so heavily publicized. So I think there's something to learn from this strategy of I would say the politics of visibility, you know, in China-Africa relations. It's really part of their strategy to showcase and for the others to be quiet as well. So I absolutely agree on that with you. Zambia, no, I'm not a specialist on the Zambian case, but what I can say is that it's not only about being anti-diplomatic. I think that, you know, this strategy is one, you know, that is called in anthropology, like the ways in which, you know, those who don't have many options left, you know, carry out a strategy that is one, well, to not to negate, but just to say no, to become a naysayer, and to it's the weapons of the weak. That's the name of this book. And so I think that's what's happening in the case of Zambia. There are renegotiations happening there, but they want to still use the platforms that they have, you know, to challenge whether it's China or, you know, other actors as well.
Okay, we have a question from Anita Spring, and then we'll follow that with a question from Karen Coker.
Anita, you're muted. Anita, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Well, that was a wonderful discussion, and you brought in so many different facets and countries. If I could, I have a number of little tiny questions at this point, but that is, what linkages, what evaluations of the PPE and then the vaccine and the origins of the vaccine. I don't think anything's coming from China as a vaccine, but mostly from Europe. Is that correct? That's one thing. And the other is that in terms of the funding from China to Africa and the agency or lack thereof, let me ask the following, and that is, are African countries wanting, I think you said this, to not have to repay using current amounts of cash that their treasury has collected, but pay over a longer period of time? And this came up yesterday as a question because everybody knows the example in Djibouti of the port becoming, and all the storage and everything around the port becoming Chinese property. And that was because of offering loan after loan after loan to the government, and the government taking all of that in. So they lost the port. But in terms of geopolitical analysis of this, I wonder, I mean, we all should be making spreadsheets, I think, of who's giving what to whom. And if China's giving vaccines and PPE, which countries in Africa sent things to China. Now, somebody would argue that that's the way it should work anyway, but I think it's the degrees to which these things have flourished and taken place that we really need to keep track of. So my question is, like, looking forward, So do you think the mask diplomacy is going to continue? Do you think the vaccine situation, keep reading everything about the poor countries are suffering so much because they'll never get the vaccines. What's happening along those lines? That's number one. And number two, where has the AU fit in terms of some kind of coordination, or any of the regional organizations around the continent, both political and economic?
Thanks, Anita. Karen, you can go ahead with your question.
All right, thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation. And so my question falls in line with the concept of health diplomacy and going, following up to Dr. Leslie's question regarding like mass diplomacy. And so while you were talking and you showed the two graphs of individuals on like constituents in these specific governments and their perceptions of aid and aid that China was allocating for their specific states, I thought about how moving forward, you know, you have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a lot of development, private sector in the Western space who donate and have funding for different health projects. And with COVID and this, you know, involvement of private sector high actors in China, you know, donating and giving funding for building hospitals, not necessarily the Chinese government. How moving forward, post-COVID, do you see this concept of, you know, as you said, I believe it was like basket strategies that African actors can be creative in developing further long-lasting relationships with China in terms of that infrastructure development?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen, for your question, and thank you, Anita, for your comment and question as well. I will answer to both actually, because they touch a bit on same. In terms of, I will call it, that's why I think people call it COVID diplomacy or Corona diplomacy, because it goes beyond mass diplomacy, right? Mass diplomacy was coined, I think, in the media first to describe all the donations of masks at the critical early stages of the pandemic. So I think, Karen, that, you know, this strategy, the whole mask PPE, I think that these countries have found a way, you know, to be able to either produce it, but I think most of the countries now have their stocks. And in the case of African countries, many of them didn't wait also for masks to come, right? There are so many stories of local tailors, you know, building their own masks at the beginning and so on. So there was also some agency at the early stages coming from within Africa. But it's for China's COVID diplomacy, I think, you know, vaccines, when you look at it, yes, Anita, there have been many orders already coming. You know, I think that there are many, there are some graphs, and I can send it to you to show you the various companies, Sinopharm, and there's another company as well that is providing, or at least it will be distributing these vaccines. On my slide, there's a slide here, and I'll use it again to show you how, you know, because it's important to make this distinction between donations and orders, right? And since it's continuing, we don't really know which countries at this stage or how many have ordered or not. But you can see on this graph here by the CGTN journalists, you can see how China, this again, right, the politics of visibility and publicization, how China will be offering vaccines for the moment to Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone. So talking from African perspectives now, since that's what the main focus of this presentation. Many of these countries, they are accepting, you know, these donations. They are ordering from China, but they also have their own basket strategy. We were asking about the African Union and regional organizations. They have their own initiative in addition to COVAX. So they are ordering also from multilateral, this multilateral initiative, and also from bilateral partners. It's about, you know, having multiple sources and not rely only on one source. So the Africa CDC and the African Union, you know, they have, really, and this has been praised, right, this sense of coordination and of agency in getting in, you know, not only the masks at the beginning, you know, working with Ethiopian Airlines, with also with the Jack Ma, the Alibaba Foundation, but there's really been a good sense of coordination here, and it's still the case. So, but the problem now is also it's access to vaccines. There have been orders, right? They have ordered many of these, but many of these companies, you know, are not able to produce at a fast pace, and especially the urgency that this situation requires. And that's why other actors like Russia, whose vaccine has now been described as safe, at least by the Lancet recently, but also China's vaccines become an alternative order. So there's really this strategy of, again, of having multiple sources. Post-COVID, Karen, post-COVID health, if I think that this basket strategy will continue, I absolutely think so. I think that this is something that was already pre-COVID. You know, I think that these governments really know that they are subject to interests, and that there's a competition from external actors, from emerging partners, you know, to become a strategic partner. And so they really built on that. And it's not only governments, it's also foundations, the $1 billion Foundation. The whole issue here is to come up with a more coherent strategy, you know, to avoid redundancies, to avoid the fact that sometimes it's, let's say, it's to avoid that it's not the emerging powers agenda or the partners agenda that, you know, that is not imposed, but that becomes the main agenda, right? It's about having your own agenda. Anita, very quickly on funding, you talked about Djibouti. Well, I think all of this is linked with the debt trap narrative, and I think that this has been countered in many research reports, that, you know, it's important to also unpack that one and see that, yes, there are many countries that have that are in a situation of debt distress. China is their bilateral creditor, but there have been no seizure of national assets, whether it's in Africa or Sri Lanka. So, but still, there is an issue here of contracting debt and contracting too much debt and being in a situation where, you know, like Zambia, where they are playing on, well, on global solidarity and on the need, you know, to move, well, to cancel this debt in this urgent case, and that's something that is quite difficult at this stage.
Hey, do we have another question or comments?
I have a question. We have been hearing a great deal about the South African variant of COVID, and so every other word is, well, will the Pfizer vaccine, or will the Moderna, and the list goes on depending on what country you're in, be able to protect itself? And I believe in South Africa, they're just about to start vaccinating a lot of people, and they withdrew the vaccine because it was not helpful about the very strain that was in their country. I don't know if it's much of a question, but I'm really curious as to whether or not you've heard comments about that or anything written about that particular group of problems. And that's one thing I wanted to ask you. And then in terms of overall coordination, I think I'm sitting in the sunlight here and getting funny colors here. In terms of coordination with vaccines, with ones that are for particular places and variants, is the AU providing, or any of these regional bodies providing guidance, or are we still mostly at the state level, the nation state?
Third, is there another question so that I can
You can do both, yeah.
take them both?
Do we have another follow-up from anyone? Otherwise, we'll just go with this one. Lena, go ahead, Lena.
Yeah, thank you, Folashade, for this amazing talk. I really appreciated your presentation and learned a lot from it. I just have a very brief question and very broad. Wondering if you have seen or read anything about so the potential for competition between China and, so not the Pfizer or Moderna, but China and other powers providing the vaccine that, for example, Russia, and if you have seen anything on sort of on how that is managed in terms of publicity. We see a lot coming out of China in terms of, or if not coming out of China, actually just, this misinformation campaigns that we see going around social media in different African countries about how the Pfizer vaccine isn't good enough, or how just trying to sort of spread fear among people on the inefficacy of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and sort of trying to portray sort of alternatives as better options. I was wondering to just, if you have any comments on, have you seen anything, is there a sense of competition also with the Russian vaccine, or is there any sense of sort of, the market is wide and, and anybody that wants to play a role in it can? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for your questions. So generally speaking, Anita, about the variants, so I don't think I have more information than you have. It's what I've been reading in the news so far is that some of the AstraZeneca vaccine on the early results from research that has been carried out by South African scientists is that it's not efficient enough, whereas others are more efficient. So I think what these countries are doing is that, like South Africa, is that they are really betting on multiple sources, as I mentioned, right? You have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that is coming up, and that is just one shot and said to be more efficient. So I think that it will delay, the process. But what I think is reassuring is that at least, they are really being very diligent and very precautious in what they administrate to their populations. Because, there are two things here. Okay, all the donations coming from China, coming from Russia, coming from other sources, but I was talking to the Africa director of the WHO last week about that. There is still among African citizens, a reluctance to get vaccinated, and this is rather historical. The Afrobarometer has been carrying out surveys, just I think Liberia and Benin results came out where they've shown that only 20% of the citizens surveyed have trust in their government to provide the best vaccine. Only 30% to 40% will get or are thinking about getting vaccinated. So there are multiple steps here, and we haven't seen the outcome yet of all of this. Where these vaccines will, in whose arms these vaccines will be shot at the end. So that's still an open question. Lena, yes, there is competition between China and other powers providing the vaccine, and I think it's important also to look at, the levels and the actors here in this whole game. I think China is donating also a lot. It's part of the strategy. We've said that. Russia is also, you know, a bit less. I think that the politics of, you know, publicization by Russia are less. They focus, they target specific countries. It's more quiet than it's loud. The example of Guinea is quite interesting. You know, how they've, China and Russia have, let's say there are two competing actors in Guinea around the mining issue. So there's no China versus US debate there. It's very small. It's mainly China versus Russia. And so the fact that Guinea is considering more and more Russia as a strategic partner is quite interesting, because it used to be China. And also the fact that they've welcomed, you know, this, you know, the tests of Sputnik 5 in Guinea is also quite telling. So Guinea is an example where there's competition between these two, but there's also, I won't say competition, but some countries like Ethiopia decided, for instance, that they would only order via the COVAX and the African Union, you know, they will go the multilateral way. So I think at some point it would be interesting to look at what are the choices. First of all, what are the options, but what are the choices and why did these countries choose for this specific option, right? So donations, okay, that I think that was the communique by the Ethiopians is, well, you know, we take it, thank you very much. But in terms of orders, you know, we won't necessarily order bilaterally, you know, to China or to Russia, any of these. In terms of the disinformation campaign, and I will make the link with what I said to my response to Anita. Yes, you know, there are many reasons for which you know, many African populations don't want to get vaccinated at this stage, at least. There's a distrust in the government. Fake news, of course, that's not new, right? Since the beginning of the pandemic. And interestingly, it's not specific to Moderna, to Pfizer. It's also, you know, to China. Just getting vaccinated is something that is also, you know, there are some historical right, memories from campaigns where Africans were just, you know, guinea pigs. Discussions by two French doctors on television that, well, why shall we not try this and that in Africa? All these things come up. So for the moment, you know, seeing alternatives from Pfizer or Moderna as better options. I think maybe in the sense of, maybe with Russia, it will be interesting to follow the Russian case, because, right, they are the first, well, the Lancet just said that it's about, I think, 91 or 92%. So this will be a game changer. And it will be really interesting to see how that will translate in the relationship, right? And how African governments and also African populations will adhere or not to this. So yes, I think there's still much to see, and right, we are not there yet. Anya.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left in our session. Do we have any more comments or questions from the room? Raise your hand.
I have a question, but I'll wait until somebody who hasn't spoken goes first.
Me too, I've got one, okay.
All right, you've got your opening. Otherwise, I've got two more questions.
Okay, do you have somebody else, Todd?
I do not yet. So either people are slow or they've missed their window.
I'll wait for Jevons or Oscar to throw their question.
Evans or Oscar, anything? Here we got. Karen has another question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Karen.
Go ahead, Karen.
I'll go.
All right. Thank you. So something that you mentioned toward the end of your presentation was this concept of like visibility politics, and I found that like very interesting, and also the intersection of like social media and that space for the spread of misinformation, but also the use for strategically showcasing these partnerships. And so obviously there's certain tides and politics here in the U.S. Do you think that like moving forward as well, these partnerships within African actors and being savvy and being creative will continue to use social media and this visibility politics to kind of move, move different negotiations, different, what's the word? It's leaving like different outcomes that they would like for their government.
So if I get your question right, are you asking whether the politics of visibility will have an impact on the negotiations?
Yes, and the
outcomes?
use, yes, and the use also of like social media in being visible with photography, pictures, statements, etc.
Well, talking first about the politics of visibility, as I mentioned, it's really strategic, but it's not new, right? It's not new at all. I think that, when you look at the Cold War era, when China wasn't as active in terms of its economic diplomacy, but was present, politically, ideologically, but there were some projects going on. Stadiums, for instance, where at least I consider them to be one example of these infrastructures that were purposed to be as visible as possible, right? There's always this idea of being, and they call these stadiums, like in Benin Republic, where I'm from, but also in other countries, it's like they call it the stadium of the friendship between the Chinese and the name of the African countries, friendship. But when you look at a stadium, for instance, it's directly linked to the people, right? People go to stadiums. People love sports, right? And there have been quite some research done on that, on how this allows China to be seen as closer, at least Chinese project to be closer to some of the needs. And I'm talking about perceptions here, not necessarily realities, but being closer to the needs of African populations. There's often a say that, when you ask someone on the street, what do you think about China in your country? They would say, at least with them, we see what they are doing. It's visible, it's concrete. So now that it's very, this showcase, it's very strategic, whether that will have an impact on the negotiations and the outcomes, I don't see a direct causality, I would say, or a direct link. What the effect that it can have is that, well, first of all, it will continue. It has been pre-COVID, it has been during COVID, and it will be post-COVID. So during the negotiations and its outcomes, I think, well, where the visibility lies during the negotiations is that the Chinese often want, or they are often bidding or, offering to fund projects that should be visible. Whether it's buildings, whether it's ministerial buildings, Congress halls, it has to be on the main streets. They are less, in terms of big infrastructure, they are less interested in bidding on something that is too far away, except if it's a road, that leads from maybe, let's say, strategic or I think medium to large size cities to these rural areas. So yes, there's a sense of making and keeping it visible, doing keeping their projects as visible as possible, and especially in a context where they are competing with others. And so in terms of the outcomes of the negotiations, I think the issue may be or there might be an issue when these governments that are negotiating are willing to to get China to fund these projects, because these projects will make them more popular, or will allow them to gain some electoral votes in some some of the districts. And so that can be an issue, because when things are done, with too much haste, I would say, well, the outcomes are not necessarily in favor of the African governments, right? So speed is something that is valued, but it can, have a counter effect of not negotiating the best terms in these agreements. So yeah, I think that's where I see the link between the two.
Thank you.
We've got another question and if we have time, I'll go to Agnes after this, but Evans, you can go ahead. Evans, are you there? Give him a second to switch over to panelist mode.
All right, so thank you very much for your presentation, and I really enjoy it. So I have two questions, and the first one is, besides the promises and the general headlines, do we as yet have a specific commitment by China regarding probably the number of vaccines or the quantity of vaccines that they will be committing to the African continent? That's my first question. Then my second question, with the vaccine and the mask diplomacy, in the immediate future, do you see that probably other areas of engagement, especially with regards to aid, are going to be affected as China tries to shift attention to the current issue of the COVID-19 and health-related problems that the continent is facing? So thank you very much. These are my brief questions.
Thank you, Evans. Thank you very much for your questions. You're asking beyond the commitments if there's real delivery. I think what this question is, well, for China so far, at least they are showcasing some deliveries, and I haven't read, or maybe, I should, at least in the case of Africa, I haven't read of, delays and so on. But again, it's very important to make this distinction between vaccine, diplomacy, the orders and so on, and vaccine aid. Donations for the moment are just to 3 to 4 countries, right? We've talked about Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, and Sierra Leone. There will be others, there's, I suppose, other, but also, they are quite, the numbers of vaccines in these batches, they're quite, let's say, about 100,000 or 200,000. So I see them more as also a symbolic donation, right? And especially since these countries also have multiple sources. So it's part of China's COVID strategy. They are delivered, but also, there's, in the whole process, I'm not a vaccine specialist, but you have the orders, the production, right, and the delivery. And so I think we are now at the order stage. So I think it's something that would be very interesting to follow up, and to compare with AstraZeneca, for instance, who accepted so many orders and who's not able to deliver at some point, or also the costs, right? In the case of AstraZeneca, I think that South Africa paid double price for it, whereas it was part of the trials. Whereas I don't know if they're also producing it, or at least India does. But so it would be interesting to see what the costs are for these vaccines coming from China. There must be some information out there, but it's evolving. Other areas of cooperation, I think health will be, and I mean, we have the summit coming up, the FOCAC summit coming up in Dakar in September normally, if it's not postponed. Health will be critical, right? I think the health cooperation and will be critical. And by health cooperation, I'm thinking about health infrastructure, in Africa, maybe knowledge exchange between medical teams, between or sending maybe, I think Lena worked on these, networks and so on, but maybe we would see more health officials, African health officials traveling for training, in China. So I think, health will be very central here. And it's an occasion for China again to be, to position itself as a key partner in this regard. But it's also for African governments to see what's in it for them. Is it, and how do they negotiate all these projects? It's not, you're not obliged to accept everything because of goodwill if it's not in your interest. So yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, I think we're going to call that the last question in the official session. You're welcome to remain in the room and continue discussing with our speaker as long as she wants to remain in the room. I will go through and turn on attendees, enable your video. It'll take me a minute or two to do that for each person. So if you're still in the room in another minute, I'm going to enable your video. But feel free to continue the conversation. And I just want to thank Folashade deeply for this important and interesting talk. And I'm going to stop the recording now so everything's off the record at this point.
Thank you.